please encourage your friends to come and join us if they're loitering outside. My name's Julie Pizzetti. I'm the freshly minted Global Research Director for the International Centre for Journalists. I've been a journalist for 30 years. My career predominantly was in Australia with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I've been an investigative reporter, a political reporter, and many other kinds of reporter and presenter. Most recently, I was with the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford, where I led a project for 18 months examining the future of journalism through the lens of a global examination of innovation. So I'm going to be talking about that. The reason I'm sitting here pretending to be Lena Ayelet, who is not with us, is that Lena has had to go and deal, as many other colleagues have, with the emergency that is unfolding in Egypt right now. And we'll talk about this in some detail, not the specific case, but the implications of external threats and crises and the way they impact on us as we attempt to build sustainable models of journalism. But the crisis I'm speaking of continues to unfold in Egypt, where Madame Asir has been taken over essentially by plainclothes security police. Anybody here who remains oblivious, I'll just give a couple of details. Staff are being held inside, their phones have been switched off. And 3 people have just been arrested in the context of this raid on Egypt's independent news organisation. So obviously we are here in solidarity as much as possible, virtually, digitally, and I think it's important to acknowledge that while we're here discussing some of the really difficult issues that confront journalism, which go well beyond business models right through to targeted attacks on journalists and news organisations, often and frequently involving the state, but also involving orchestrated disinformation campaigns and a range of other threats, the ultimate manifestation of which is, of course, the murder of journalists with impunity. So I do think it's important to set up a conversation about the future of journalism with an emphasis on those very real challenges that intersect with all of the other challenges we're dealing with, which range from technology and the ways in which we might have been captured by technology-led approaches to innovation, along with business model renovation and approaches to content that are new and audience-focused and perhaps audience-led. So these are the sorts of issues we'll try and tease out through a range of case study approaches. I'm just going to introduce the panel. First of all, as Lena, as I said, can't be with us. She's with us in spirit. To my left is my new colleague, actually, from ICFJ, Fatima, and Baja. Fatima, how do I pronounce your last name? Baja. I'm trying to apply a Spanish pronunciation to an Arabic name. Apologies in advance. So Fatima has just led a project at ICFJ that involved the second global survey of journalism and technology. So she's going to talk to us about what that has been found specifically in the MENA region. And next to her is Alia Ibrahim, and Alia, I might just get you and Hassan actually to describe your organisations just before we get into a conversation. What is it that you do?
I'm co-founder of ARIJ Media. It's an independent Beirut-based media that is involved in conversational and impact-driven journalism. We launched 2 years ago.
Great. And Hassan, if you could do the same, please. I think Hassan's going to speak in Arabic, so if those of you who need a translation, mic set, go for it.
أول شيء مرحبا جميعا، شكرا لحضوركم. أنا الكو-إديتور إن شيف لموقع رصيف 22 اللي هو بلاتفورم بان عرب بيهتم بأمور سياسية واجتماعية وثقافية، وواحدة يعني أكيد الوسائل الإعلامية البديلة.
Okay, great, thanks. And Bilal Randari also joins us from MDIF. Do you want to give us a brief introduction to your work?
Sure. MDIF is the Media Development Investment Fund. We are a New York-based non-profit, and we invest in independent media companies around the world, with my focus being Africa and the Middle East. we've been around for 26 years. We do debt and equity financing, so we don't do grants in that sense. Yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. So the name of the panel is New Journalism, New Models. So I want to begin by just talking about what I planned originally to bring to the discussion, which is some reflections on this 18-month project I led for the Reuters Institute, which was called the Journalism Innovation Project. I've just tweeted, for those of you who are interested in digging into some of the findings and some of the case studies from that research project, I've just tweeted links to all of the reports, which are freely available, so I'll mention that up front. So this project, which I have to declare, and relevantly, given some of the discussions we've had here, was actually funded by the Facebook Journalism Project, ran for 18 months. Unfortunately, it came to an end when Facebook, in its infinite wisdom and perpetual state of pivoting, decided not to extend the funding for the project. So there's a declaration up front. And it's relevant to our discussions about how we engage with platforms, how we manage what I call platform capture, which is one of the findings from this research. So let me talk you through a bit about what I found. And I worked on this project with two colleagues who are not here, Felix Simon, who is a German journalist and now PhD student, and Nabila Shabir, who is an ex-Guardian journalist and also now the conversation editor at The Correspondent, which is the English language version of De Correspondent. She's now based in the Netherlands. So the first piece of work that we did was being led by 30 international experts, so editors, product people, senior journalists, startup pioneers in the news industry, to identify what the key challenges were for innovation. It's a buzzword, journalism innovation. We need more innovation. Innovation is critical to our future. Without innovation, we will die. These are the sorts of things we hear frequently, and they're the sorts of reasons that justified investment in this research. So the idea initially was to find what are the key challenges and impediments for innovation. What I found through this series of research interviews and roundtable discussions with this selected group of experts, and you can find out by reading the study exactly who they were, was that the most urgent concern was something called shiny things syndrome, which was identified by one of the editors, or named by one of the editors. And this syndrome was defined as essentially being technology-led, so Western platform, social media companies effectively driving the innovation and experimentation that was happening in news organisations. So this idea of shiny things syndrome also brought with it a degree of fatigue and burnout as a result of perpetual change and the unreliability of such dependency on constantly changing platforms. So there was also a desire to pull back from this perpetual pivoting that we hear about in journalism. You all will be familiar with the so-called pivot to video. I know that there'll be different manifestations in this region. But the idea was to try to then respond to this identified set of problems with more meaningful, purposeful, sustainable models and modes of innovation, and to try to identify what some of the markers for genuinely innovative journalism and news organisations internationally might be. So it was a big ask. Early on, we established that we couldn't just think about innovation in terms of what I describe as the journalism innovation wheel, which had these 8 spokes that I came up with, which included audience engagement, business and commercial development, culture and leadership, and a whole range of other elements. At the top, of course, was reporting and storytelling. In addition to these 8 identified modes of innovation, which could overlap and intersect, I said that what we needed to emphasise was that perhaps the biggest identifier potentially for capacity to innovate was in fact the ability to respond creatively to external threats and crises, and challenges like the absence of diversity in our news organisations, recognising that diverse audiences, whether that's around gender or race or culture or class, having a diversity of audience participants is essential to establishing business models that were sustainable and journalism that would find an audience. So that was the first part of the study. The second part of the study, which has been manifested in two major reports published recently by the Reuters Institute, focused on news organisations I identified as digital born. In fact, two of them were social media platform born, Facebook born in fact, and from the global south, so countries that were not the typical countries where the Reuters Institute would go to try and identify what the trends were when it came to innovation. Typically we would have gone into Western, European and North American news organisations, interviewed a large number of people randomly about what it was that they were doing, what were they finding, what were they experimenting with, and so on. Instead, I decided to pivot this project to focus on three newsrooms that I had already identified as pushing boundaries in new and interesting ways. Those three newsrooms were Rappler in the Philippines, which is led by four women, most notable among them the rather exceptional Maria Ressa, who in fact was hoping to be able to be here with you, but had other commitments in Iceland and has just flown back to the Philippines, where things are increasingly treacherous for her and for Rappler. Daily Maverick in South Africa, which does really spectacular work in trying to produce fierce, independent accountability journalism, particularly in an environment under the previous President Zuma, which was one where corruption seemed to grow by the minute, and where there are increasingly virulent attacks on journalists and news organisations triggered by the sort of political rhetoric of political movements there. And the third was the Quint in India. The Quint and Rappler were both born as Facebook pages. They really saw social media platforms as a way to build audiences, to find audiences, to build new news organisations that were audience-led. And both the Daily Maverick and Rappler, of course, won jointly just a couple of months ago one of the most prestigious international investigative journalism prizes that GIJN gives. And those prizes were for cutting-edge reporting on, in the case of the Philippines, the drug war there, and in the case of Daily Maverick, its collaborative work on the Gupta leaks, which was a series of stories that ultimately brought down or contributed to the downfall of Zuma. So that's the nature of this project. Some of the key things I found with my colleagues was that responding to these external threats, disinformation, primary among them, and one of the features of orchestrated disinformation campaigns is the targeted attacks on journalists, especially women journalists. And we've talked a lot here in different settings about online harassment. That's because it's becoming a trend globally, but it's a trend that, as Maria Ressa would say, is, has been really a canary in the coal mine experience, to quote an English expression. It's like news organisations in unstable democracies or destabilised democracies in particular, in the global south, being harangued and harassed, and the utilisation of these sorts of approaches to trying to chill and silence journalism is a trend that is moving, and the weaponisation of the platforms for disinformation purposes is also a trend that's moving from the global south to the west with increasingly toxic impacts. So it was in looking at the ways that the Quint, for example, in India, used its audiences as creative collaborators on anti-disinformation journalism, using WhatsApp groups initially as a way of trying to combat the extraordinary levels of disinformation in the Indian sphere, particularly in the lead-up to the last election. So collaborative, citizen-engaged journalism is one of the approaches that was experimented with across the three organisations. Secondly, at all of the three organisations, a membership approach to sustaining the business has been adapted, and I'd be interested to hear, as we go from some of our colleagues, about the viability and relevance of membership models in this region, in the MENA region. So the membership idea being that in response to the inability or unwillingness of people to pay for content traditionally, the collapse of the advertising model, and also the fact that in many parts of the world, the idea of forking out money to buy journalism is just not an option. So the membership models being deployed at each of these organisations is really an effective way of doing two things. One of them is to try to deepen and strengthen and narrow the audience to defend themselves and protect themselves against these sorts of audience toxicity experiences where there are large weaponized audiences. And secondly, to allow people who can afford to pay for independent quality news to do so, to ensure that it can be made freely available for a much bigger group of people. So I'll stop talking about this now, but maybe I'll come back to some of the points and some of the learnings, other than to say that one of the key things that I think we need to consider and respond to based on this research with international implications is this idea of platform capture. And this is a concept that has three elements. The first element involves recognition that the platforms have been weaponized, they have been manipulated, they are unfortunately, tools of free expression which have been turned against journalists and journalism and against truth and facts. This is a problem we have to engage with and think about how, in our attempt to build sustainable news organizations, we deal with that. The second element is the complicity of the platforms in effectively ensuring that journalists and organisations become dependent on them for distribution and audience engagement. And that includes, the risks of constantly changing policies and also the perpetual algorithmic shifts. And the third point is the willingness of news organisations to effectively allow themselves to be so captured. And I think that gets to an idea of the way we need to build resilience and adaptability connected to innovation. So let me come to you, if I can, Fatima. Can you talk to us, please, about what ICFJ has found in its global study of news organisations and journalists in reference to the way in which they're interacting with technology, now that I've set this up as a kind of dystopia? What did we find?
We have some promising signs. It's okay.
Good.
First, I just want to say thank you to everyone for showing up. This being the last session, I half expected it to be more speakers than audience, and I'm really glad that it's not the case. I'm going to just be speaking about this study that Julie mentioned called The State of Technology in Global Newsrooms that ICFJ launched recently this year. The goal of the study is to really understand how media professionals worldwide are adapting to the digital era and the changes that we're seeing everywhere and constantly. And I'm just going to dive right in the interest of time. The study was funded by Google and Fusion with support from Georgetown University. Sorry, why is this not working? Oh, and we administered, this is a survey study, we administered the survey in 14 languages, one of which was, of course, Arabic, with the goal of reaching as many journalists worldwide as possible, and to a degree we were successful. We reached more than 4,100 journalists from 149 countries, which we then also looked at the regional trends in addition to the global. And I'm going to speak specifically today about the Middle East, about the challenges that we're seeing, and sort of use these challenges as a framework to give some context to the trends and the conversation, the rest of the conversation from my colleagues. Can we turn this TV on?
Is it possible to see the slides? She can't see the slides on the screen,
That's
so she's
okay.
having to tilt her head around.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no. Is it possible to have them projected on the TV screen here?
Sorry, but let's dive right into the challenges. So what you're seeing here is a snapshot of the top 10 challenges that news managers in the Arab world have identified as major for them, led, of course, by shifting revenue streams, which is not at all surprising, given the decline in ad revenues. And you'll see that attracting advertisers is a challenge that shortly follows shifting revenue streams. I also want to note other related challenges, I think, mainly challenges related to audiences. A lot of managers are struggling to build a loyal audience and to ensure audience trust. More than half have said that this is a major challenge for them. And another significant challenge, an important challenge, I think, for this conversation is newsrooms are having a hard time recruiting and retaining talented journalists. So let's break down the challenges a little bit and talk about the associated trends, starting with the business. Like I said, not a unique challenge to the Middle East. This is very much, as Julie noted, a global problem. But we did notice that it was more urgent in the Middle East than it was elsewhere. And we asked news managers to identify specifically what their current top revenue source is and what they anticipate to become important revenue sources in the future, with the goal of understanding how they're planning on shifting their revenue models to adapt to the changes in the industry. So here's a quick snapshot of the current top revenue sources identified by MENA newsroom managers. First, you'll see that there is actually a good diversity of funding sources. There's not one funding source that captures a majority of newsrooms, but it is led by government funding. The most newsroom managers said that they rely on government funding to operate. Philanthropic contributions and grants are also still somewhat important, cited by 19% of news managers. You'll also see that traditional advertising and digital display advertising don't capture a large portion of the market, and that's actually consistent with what we found globally. Most newsrooms worldwide today are relying on alternative funding sources, not on advertising, to sustain their operations. But I also wanted to note the smaller pockets of funding here, to your point, Julie. A very small portion of newsrooms, which doesn't seem significant here, identified membership, audience subscriptions and memberships, as well as audience donations as their top funding source. So let's fast forward to 2020 and see what they expect to become important in the future. The first thing you'll notice is that there's an expectation that digital display advertising will explode in size in terms of as a revenue source. Philanthropic contributions and traditional advertising are still expected to be somewhat important, while at the same time you'll see that government funding is expected to decline. But let's go back to this audience subscription and donations question. And even though they still look somewhat small, if you compare them to the current year, you'll see that there's an expectation that they will more than quadruple in size in the future. And what this really indicates to us is that there's an awareness among news managers in the region that they need to begin relying more directly on their audiences to generate revenue and to ensure that their businesses are succeeding, which is overall, I think, a promising sign. So how are they reaching the audiences? This is probably not unexpected in this region, but the short answer is instant messaging. Instant messaging platforms are so key to the industry in the Arab world that truly the Middle East is a leader when it comes to distributing content via platforms like WhatsApp, like Telegram, and like Facebook Messenger. Almost all newsrooms are doing this now in the region. And even journalists are among the top globally. Arab journalists are among the top globally in relying on these platforms to engage audiences directly in the storytelling process. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they still are very much in the lead. Finally, let's talk about the last challenge, which is recruiting journalists. Obviously, if your concern is to engage more audiences and reach more audiences, you need to think about who's in your newsroom and who they're representing. And unfortunately, this is very much an area that we could stand to benefit from. I'm bringing this back to women. Women are very much underrepresented in the newsroom in the MENA region. They represent less than 1/3 of news employees, and even fewer hold positions of management in the newsroom. And what this really tells us is that there's a significant portion of the population whose interests are not being addressed, whose stories are not being told adequately, and who are not being reached with content that is important to them. So I think to just bring it all together, to tell these stories is to improve your content, to reach more audiences, which in turn becomes better business models and greater revenue. This is just a very quick snapshot of the study, but I'm happy to answer some more questions about regional or global trends. You can also email me or tweet me directly after this conversation. You can also check out our survey with the link here, and I've left a few of these fun little teaser cards about the study, so you can check it out. We're also planning on releasing the executive summary and some of the highlights that were shown here in Arabic on our website soon. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Fatima. Alia, can I come to you? Can you perhaps begin maybe by responding to some of the challenges and shifts that were identified there by Fatima? So in terms of the sorts of obstacles that you're trying to overcome, or the challenges that you're trying to deal with within your own startup news environment.
Well, yeah, I come from mainstream media, so moving from being an employee in a newsroom where I had to fight for my stories, but never for the resources to do my stories. For me, it was like I should have been given that. Now I'm on the other side where the sustainability in terms of having the resources to do the stories has become more of my job. But before I go there, we started this session with you mentioning why Lina's not here. And I think it's very much related to what kind of journalism we're doing right now. Lina's not here because there is an OR that she's running to support another colleague, Lina Atalla and Mada Masr, who are facing, today they have been raided, their newsroom has been raided, there has been arrests. And this is also part of the new journalism model. Like this kind, there is of course solidarity, there is of course consolidation, but there is also a sense of being part of the same network of independent journalists is also part of protecting oneself. It's not only because it's the good thing to do, it's because as a breed of independent journalists or independent journalism organization in a culture that is getting started to understand why this is good, why this is needed. The whole thing, I think, it's a learning curve for everybody. But you see how the story is unfolding today, and you see, as opposed to 10 years ago, how we used to, even this kind of stories, how they used to be covered, how fast you get the information, how fast the lobbying gets done, how fast the pressure is done. I'm not saying, of course, the situation in our countries are getting increasingly more oppressive, probably because things are moving at the same pace. There is more freedom in more freedom because of the technology on one side, and more oppression because of that on the other side. So this is to a large extent, if I take, like, this is one thing. Another thing, we have two revolutions at least that are unfolding in Lebanon and in Iraq. And as a newsroom, you've asked us and you said we rely on WhatsApp, for example, a lot. As an independent media newsroom, it's very difficult for us to compete with TV. TV is still the number one. It's still the engine of shaping public opinions. Yeah. But at the same time, the role that we have as independent media is to interfere when things go wrong on mainstream media. And the fact that we have access to news through WhatsApp, through network of journalists who are all over the place, who otherwise would be totally incapable of letting their voices be heard. Specifically, for example, today in Iraq, there are networks of independent journalists who are doing fantastic jobs and who don't have platforms. And the fact that they are a group and they do the fact-checking and they're really doing excellent journalistic work, and because of the technology, they're being capable of sending, despite the shutdown on the internet half of the day. If this was not available, we wouldn't have access to information as a platform. We rely extensively on this kind of information as a platform. On the other hand, even outside the independent media, the fact that we're no longer at the mercy of mainstream media in shaping public opinions is an amazing development in the newsroom. So this is the part where it has to do with content, pretty much. Yes. On the other hand, I want to go very quickly over, you mentioned the issue of membership. Yes. In the case, for example, of ARIJ, if you've asked me 2 years ago when we launched, I was one of the people who would like very, very confidently say Arabs will not pay for content. I said that too many times. And then as time was passing and out of experience, we've been in specific cases where actually people were sending us emails and asking us, how can we support you?
Because they were invested in your journalism.
Because I'll give very specific example. When journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, and it was a big story that all the mainstream media did not cover properly, each for their own biases. But at the end of the day, if you wanted to know news, not editorial additions to it, just getting the facts of what's happening, you had to go to international media, because the Arab media was split between, it was polarized, as is the case in most big stories. So when we published an editorial, that was saying, this is when you need independent media, because somebody's paying for what you're reading. And if it's not you, then it's somebody else. And whoever is paying is actually deciding what sort of stories you're going to listen to. And when we published that specific editorial, we started getting emails from people saying, well, we really believe this is important. You know, it has to be a specific case. People get motivated when you give them a very specific example why they need to invest in independent media. Now, the reason why we did not go for that is because we felt we're not ready for it. Our audience is not big enough, our distribution is not big enough, and in terms of resources, we're not ready to go there yet. So we decided that we're testing other revenue streams, and this thing that we're journalists, you mentioned earlier Rappler and Malaysia. These are models that we look at. We feel that Asia is more accessible to us than the European model or the American model. So it's doable. If 10 years ago Asian startups were able to do it, we're 10 years behind, but it's doable. So the fact that we're journalists who are like behaving and building a mindset of worrying really about making financial contribute, like making sure that we have the resources that we need, we're testing the different revenue. We see what works. We're very small, so we're still at a stage where even if we make a mistake, it's fine. We try it, we test it, it doesn't work. It is good that we have a little bit of time to figure out what's the best thing that's going to work for us. And eventually, I think, the thing is, we're in a fantastic market. Like the Arab audience market, the Arabic speakers market is an amazing place to be, and there is a huge demand. So, yeah, I think that's it.
So I might come back and get each of you, in fact, so you can start thinking about the biggest failure, particularly you two guys who are operating independent news organizations in this region. What was the biggest risk you took, or the biggest failure that you experienced in trying to experiment to get to a model of sustainability? So keep that in mind. Hassan, can I get you, please, to talk to us about what kinds of challenges you're currently dealing with, you know, what you've learned so far along the way? Can someone just turn on Hassan's microphone? Yeah, there you go. Yep. Yep, we can hear you now.
مرحبا مرة تانية. بالأساس قالوا لي إنه لازم أحكي بس 5 دقايق، هنا عم يحكوا عشرات. أنا رح ألزم ال5 دقايق وراح.
I will stick to the 5 minutes, and I will try to address some of the issues that may be useful. And not just about the media platform I represent, which is the Rasif 22. As an introduction, and you know this already, but it will bring me into my topic. There is no media platform in the whole world that can cover the costs from the media work it carries out. This is the model globally. In the Arab world, the situation is even worse than in the West or in North America. In the Arab world, in order to cover or bridge this gap between the running costs of a media platform and between what the ads would bring in, would be to have a role for political money, which could be direct or those that come through ads. The advertising market is not separate from the political market. In many countries, the more repressive the regime, the greater this relationship. And the advertiser, in order to place the advertisements in a certain place and not in another, would do so upon some political drive or push. This is for the normal media, and we are not really part of it. We are considered to be alternative media. We are closer to the citizen than we are to powers or to government. Alternative media in the Arab region have commonalities. None of these can cover their running costs. None of them can cover a large portion of their work in the media to provide the content that we know. If it's a website, we know through the articles it publishes or the videos that it broadcasts. Nobody can generate money from this purely media work. So some, in order to cover this gap, take numerous models. One model is to have some work in addition to the media work, such as providing certain services. These could be training, for example, services. For example, but still, the main point is that as media work, it will not cover its costs. The second point is most platforms will try to bridge this gap or this deficit by seeking for sources of funding. The different donors who would provide money to the media are limited. They are well known. They are maybe 10 to 20 maximum. And because all these platforms will all go to the same sources, sometimes this creates an unhealthy atmosphere in the interrelationship between the different media. Instead of being all cooperating as alternative media platforms, we are all competing. And here I would like to say that just as in our countries, we see many conflicts. In our countries, we see many conflicts that are competition on resources or economic competition, but it is presented as though there are ideological differences. So this is the same atmosphere that prevails amongst the alternative media platforms. Now, in Racif 22, and this is our experience, and this is the only thing I could say that could be of use to you. When we started in August 2013, we had hope that we can present a model that will cover a large part of its costs through advertisements. And then we discovered that this is impossible. And during the experience, many events unfolded. In the first stage, 2013, 14, and maybe early 2015, we tried to have a parallel or a balance between two sides or two opinions amongst those who work in the platform, to think of how we can win more viewers or readers. For when we say we want more ads, we need more readers. And the advertiser not only seeks larger numbers. Of course, they look at the numbers, but I wish they would only look at them at numbers. They would also discriminate. They want specific numbers in specific countries with certain qualifications. And these have to do with their economic power, purchasing power. If this person will not buy the goods, then what do I need with them? Why should I advertise? So our aim was to reach the largest number of readers in all Arab countries. Secondly, the team of RASIF 22 that drew up the identity and principles of the platform carried a number of principles that most of us share. We all want change. We have political and social concerns. We are not satisfied with the political situation in our countries. We are not content with the forms of social relations prevalent in our countries. We want to talk about all these issues. At the same time, we want our content to reach out to the largest number of readers. What we realized later was, in addition to the difficulty of covering the cost from advertisements, it was that we have to work, if we work with carrying principles in our mind having to do with freedoms and liberties, then we cannot make plans. In 2018, our platform was blocked in Egypt. In 2019, it was blocked in Saudi Arabia. So if you're building a business model that will try to be normal and linked to the market, then the decision of some power, some authority, could put an end to your planning that has been in the works for years, because everything builds up gradually. So in order to build a business model, we have to say that you cannot control everything. It is the governments that control everything ultimately. During this process, we came up with what distinguishes our platform and entrenches its identity as a platform or as a site. I'm not... And in this we are different perhaps than other alternative media. This stems from the thinking that developed over 4 or 5 years in preparing for this website. We want to have the content that reflects our dreams and aspirations and at the same time reaches out to a large number of people. RASIF 22 always has this content that focuses or carries itself on these 2 legs. We moved away from elitist thinking, like I want to write and whoever wants to read, let them read. And I'm writing even though I'm convinced that there are I will no longer find readers. No, we try to break this rule. We are aware, and everybody knows this, we are aware that reading figures in the Arab world are not very encouraging. But if you are a media institution, then you want to reach out and build a relationship with the readers. And this is the dynamism that gave the form of RASIF 22. After an experience that started in 2013, I'll tell you where we stand today. Today, we have to keep on thinking of how we will continue for the coming period. When we think about this, we have to think how our website will find what will cover its costs. And we think of a number of solutions. One is subscriptions of the reader by readers, or the support by the readers. And a while ago, we established a link where any reader who likes this website and feels a link with it or feels it expresses his aspirations, then they can make a contribution or provide support. This is one point, and this started to be effective since a few months. But again, in all transparency, this does not cover even 1% of what we need. We have no hope that this will cover, at least in the coming 2 years, it will cover much of what we need. It will cover only a very small percentage of what we need. A second source that we have been considering in order to sustain ourselves, when RACIF 22 started, a personal donation covered all the costs. This person was affected by the atmosphere of the Arab Spring and the need to do something that will address the Arab masses and express their aspirations. And secondly, the idea that a media outlet could be created that would ultimately cover its costs, and perhaps here there was an error. Our experience demonstrated that we cannot do this. And the third source for funding that we are considering is persons who want to be part of the board and can provide support for sustainability. All alternative media are also searching alongside us partnerships with donor parties with whom we could agree on certain principles and would provide such support.
The last
You
source.
have We're only going to do
The
5.
last source. المصدر الأخير
The last source is still there. It's the advertisements, and there is an idea to establish a coalition with the ARIJ and others, alternative media platforms where we can have advertisements commonly. So these are the alternative media.
Well, can I get you, please, to respond to some of the challenges and motivations and various methods that are being experimented with here by our two colleagues in this region in particular, with reflection on some of the data points that Fatima also kind of observed. When you are looking to invest in what you hope will be sustainable independent journalism internationally, and particularly in this region, what are the markers that you're looking for? And perhaps if you can outline some of the things that you find encouraging about what you see here, but also what the big impediments are to investment.
Thanks, and thanks to the fellow panelists for covering I think way more than should be covered in such a short amount of time. Traditionally, MDIF hasn't looked at the region. We've only begun to do so actively over the last year and a bit. And a big shift for us has been how we consider in the pie of what revenue looks like, what percentage that should be grants, but also how that changes over time. So, for example, as we know, most of the independent alternative media organizations have relied on grants in one form or the other. What we're asking, or what we'd like to see ideally, is looking at the last 2 years and looking at the forward 2 years. So over this period, what is the trend showing? Are you the type of organization that started off at 100% grants, 90% grants, and are you moving gradually towards this diversification of revenue? So we're considering grants as a source of revenue, and over time you're moving towards diversification with the acknowledgement that grants would continue to make up a piece of that pie. What are some of the other pieces of the pie? Yes, we've alluded to some of them now. There is still money in advertising. In some of the less developed markets, advertising in print is still pretty big. This has led to some of the clients in the global south considering, these are digital native products, by the way, that are now considering to get into print. Why? Because they've capped out the maximum they can get in the digital landscape, and there's money on the table when it comes to print, and you've got a number of sunk costs when it comes to production of the content. So your writers are still there, they're producing the content, you're putting it online. There is, in some, see the most important thing is, as Alia mentioned, these assumptions that we make. Journalists, editors, we are experts, we know a lot about everything. And we throw around these assumptions that Arabs don't pay for news, young people don't read long form, digital is the future, print is dead. Like all of these assumptions, I think to some extent are true in certain contexts, but the same way no solution can be imported as a perfect model. I mean, you look at the Washington Post, they've got the richest man in the world with the most expensive editor in the world, and it's taken them 3 or 4 years to come up with a model which is only beginning to show signs of sustainability. So, the lesson to take from that is not to say, oh, if this is what the Washington Post has done, this is the steps we're going to follow to move towards our sustainability within our organizations, but rather, let's recenter our focus on our audiences. Let's begin to engage at the necessary level with our audiences. Let's understand what our audiences want, how much they prepared and can afford to contribute towards the work that we're doing. What are the things that we've been doing that we no longer need to do? I mean, a lot of discussion when it comes to models is around revenue. How do we make more money? How do we subsidize our revenue by doing events, by doing merchandising, by doing e-commerce? Fine, let's look at the revenue line, but let's also pay attention to the cost line. What are the luxuries that journalism over decades has become comfortable with that is no longer feasible? I don't know what those are. It's in our operations, we see it being very different things for different organizations. And the type of organizations we work with is very broad. 2 of our clients that you've studied in depth, the Daily Maverick, we've worked with them on their membership program. And using Stilly and the Daily Maverick team, not to convince others to do memberships now in South Africa, but rather the opposite, to convince them not to do it. Right? Because the success of the Daily Maverick has been in a very specific context. They've been able to capture a portion of the market, which we have to acknowledge can never, it's not prepared to contribute beyond that. So let's use this example of the Daily Maverick and the lessons that they've learned to convince others that right now is not the time for you to get into memberships. Rappel in Philippines is another one of our clients. And I don't know how much more time I have, but...
Probably a minute.
A minute. I want to summarize and to say, like, the one message I can leave today for media organizations is right now, the model for sustainability is diversification of revenue. Considering that membership can be part of that revenue, advertising should be part of it, grants should be part of it, and you need to begin to look at non-traditional sources of revenue. It could be events, it could be, running a coffee shop, and whatever it is, some sort of other business line that has to subsidize the journalism, because journalism is not a profitable endeavor. And so, as an organization that a lot of people find surprising, that in 2019 we are trying to find independent media organizations producing great journalism that are not just sustainable but are profitable. So that this is how our model works. We have this pot of money, we lend money out, or we make investments out, and we need to keep on putting back into the pot a growing amount, right? The fact that we have over 100 clients around the world, I think, is evidence enough that journalism is not dead, the media is not in such a dire situation. But I caveat that by saying there's no silver bullet, there's no, you can't sit in a 1-hour workshop, in a 1-day workshop, in a 1-week workshop,
or through one panel.
And figure out, you are the experts. You know for your market what's working, what's not working. And you, without a doubt, need to be doing more engagement with your most important stakeholder, which was never that important in the past, which is your audience. In the past, your audience was always what you sold to the advertiser. Now your audience is the one that you need to build up the most trust with, and you need to, together with them, acknowledge this fact that the future is one where they would have to contribute a lot more, and you need to be working for them in a much deeper sense.
And I'd add to that based on the research I've done with these organisations, that you need to try and move your audiences to action as active supporters of your journalism, which is very much connected to the trust relationship and the physical investment in terms of cash. We have time for some questions, so I'm going to take 3 questions, one after the other. Please make them questions, not statements at this point, and I'll put them to our panellists, and we'll go 5 minutes over since we started 5 minutes late. Right here, man with his hand up. And if there are 2 other people who have questions that we can put to the panellists. I know it's the end of the day, we're all exhausted. There's one over here as well, if you want to clock him to my left, and one here to my right up the front. Okay, do you want to ask your question? Just tell us who you are if you're comfortable doing that. It's not on, so you need to push the button, I think. We're having tech issues. It's held out this long, but... Okay. We seem to have lost the microphones. Tech desk. Okay, now they're working.
Okay.
We're working up. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. I'll ask in Arabic.
Yes, sure.
محمد خماسي الجزيرة. في عندي سؤالين محوريات في موضوع الإعلام البديل الآن. أول واحد فيهم في موضوع الكراود فاندنج والأهمية اللي عم يكتسبوا هذا الشيء عالميا.
Importance that it is gaining Mother Jones in US when it did correspond in the Netherlands, and from where the US site was there, and also another great magazine in UK. In the pan-Arab world, there was a Jordanian journalist, a female journalist, worked on this, on a book and some story, Rima Shannak. All of these experiences are very beautiful. However, the difference or the common thing, they are addressing the issues of the people. And many of the sites that are publishing materials that are contextless, and they are talking about the concerns of people, and this is a leeway to the other questions. People are losing confidence in these platforms. If I read any media platform, I should know who the financier is. This is important for me. I know I work for Al Jazeera and I know who finances. So ما سؤالك? What's your question? ما هو سؤالك? We should look for the sources of funding for these platforms. What is the alternative? They always ask about the source of funding and they do not reveal it. And then people would lose the confidence in such platforms. Alia, مصادر. I will answer in Arabic. I am in disagreement with you regarding the content of the alternative media. It is there in order to bridge the gap that the mainstream media is not covering. There has been lengthy discussions on these issues, and this is focused by the alternative media, and this is not covered by the mainstream media. For funding, we are mentioning the sources of funding, and this is key for us. If it is an essential reason for the alternative media, we did not get them from the space. Yes, we approached specific organizations with common values, and it is not political funding. In the Arab landscape is political or politics-based, and it is difficult to deal with it. Yes, transparency should be there, and the relationship between or the confidence between the Arab readers and the media in general at the low levels. And this is a challenge for the alternative media to prove itself that it is functioning properly. Therefore, transparency in funding is imperative. It needs a lot of time, and it is so accurate. We as societies, we very quickly take decisions about conspiracy, and other issues of the same nature. These are necessary things. These gray areas, normally there are misuses. Being urgent on giving decisions or judgmental in giving decisions, journalism is costly, valuable, and will never be profitable. This funding should come from a source with common values with our goals. I hope that I have answered your question. Thank you, Alia. Another question من الصف الأمامي هناك.
Rami Ruhaim, BBC Arabic. I was just wondering what the panelists, given the, you've all, I think, touched on the issue of audiences being engaged, whether you have any thoughts about the idea of public commissioning, basically turning to the public for ideas about what are issues important that need to be covered, which maybe aren't covered in the mainstream, or where there is a specific interest from people to know more about a certain topic.
Would you like to take that, Hassan or Alia? Or Bilal, you look like you're ready to answer.
So, I mean, I've got an example of the Daily Maverick that we've spoken a lot about. Through the membership program now has, so what we were discussing with them before they launched the membership, they were like kind of preempting what their members would be interested in. So, you know, some of the things thrown around is they might be interested in a Daily Maverick mug or a hoodie, or, you know, these type of things that newsrooms all over think, oh, yeah, this is what our audience wants. But the things that they prioritized was being part of the conversation within the newsroom, and being able to provide both leads for stories when they have information, but also suggestions for topics that need to be covered. Another example we're looking at in South Africa is a very innovative WhatsApp-based news service that started around the elections, bringing the youth voice to the elections. And this was built on the premise that the voices of the youth have been excluded from the discourse around the elections and the coverage and so on. And so they've begun to build, I mean, the issue is that they're based on WhatsApp, and now they've become a bit platform dependent, and they're trying to, you know, move on and be on other platforms. But this idea that what are the things that, what are the questions? So for example, they're bringing a politician or a candidate to crowdsource the questions from the audience themselves, and slowly to build that into audience-led discussion, with the caveat being that fine, to some extent, you want to give your audience the opportunity to give input into that, but you want to have a strong idea of what your editorial stance is and what your vision and mission is. And so there's a delicate balance that needs to be maintained also in that space. I'm going
to wind you up there, Bilal, because we're running out of time. I want to come to this last question. 2 caveats on that, though. WhatsApp has been vital in India up until now for building audiences. The Quint, which had over 1 million WhatsApp interactions, has now had to shift to Telegram because of a change in terms and conditions on WhatsApp. So this is this constant challenge that we have to deal with. And Daily Maverick, like others, have found that they need to pull back to a much more closed environment to have these conversations because of the toxicity they're experiencing, the brutal abuse of their journalists in a wide-scale digital environment. Hassan, did you have an example that you wanted to add to that question about involving your audiences in agenda setting? I need to push that button.
هلا بالحقيقة مثلا أنا في أحكي عن كل حدا تجربة.
I cannot talk about other experiences. They are different. We always test out to see what are the points of interest that our possible readers are interested in. And these interests are demonstrated through what they publish or post on social media. This does not mean we only write about these issues. there is always those who monitor the interests. We know where our audience is, where our readers are. We know the broad titles of their interests at certain periods. And we tried, when we provide content, to have a meeting between what we present and what they are looking for at a certain period. Another point, it's very important what you have just said. One of the things we are thinking of, and we will be putting into application in the coming 4 months, approximately, or up to 6 in the coming 6 months, we are trying to give the reader the possibility to ask for further highlighting or further illumination on certain issues that they feel are lacking.
We have a third and final question here down the front.
الثالث وأخير.
عربي أنا هند شاهين من مؤسسة فريدريش ناومان من
I'm from Friedrich Naumann for Freedom. My question comes from Fatma's intervention. She said, depending on advertisements and what that can provide now, I am very interested in independent media. Can you count on the corporate responsibility of companies to get funds from them in the issues that interest them, for these affect the needs of citizens in different countries? Is it possible to depend on the CSR of corporations? Is it possible? You mean taking grants from these companies' sponsored content?
Stories or projects.
For instance,
interest.
stories about women's rights, stories about environment.
لا احنا بشكل عام عم نشوف انه
In general, we find that sponsored content is on the rise, and institutions are depending on it more and more over the last 2 years. I do not know if this is the case in the Arab world, but perhaps with grants and philanthropic funding it will. Yes, there is such a role.
I'm just going to clarify. Sponsored content is generally a term used to describe native advertising or content that's promotional for a particular brand. I think we're talking here about grant funding that's specific to projects that, and in fact, Alia, I think you wanted to make a point, and then we're going to have to wind it up.
It's already started. Again, the market is a little bit immature, but it's already started. We're developing concepts, whereas we go to specific sponsors working. It's not, the general rule is that for whatever we're producing cannot be compromising our journalism on the other side. So it has to be compatible with our general values. But we see that there is a lot of advertisement money that we could access to exactly from CSR perspective. And in relation to big environment, women empowerment, like things we care too much about, and we know that there are big advertisers who are allocating a lot of, not necessarily just advertisement money, but also marketing money and PR money. So,
okay, I think we better wind it up there. It's now 6:10, time to allegedly go and party. There was somebody with, sorry, there's a question with a microphone. I missed you, I'm sorry.
No problem. راح أحكي بالعربي. أحمد منينة طالب في جامعة الشرق.
I am Ahmed Menina at the Middle East University. I thought of a point, and it is also a question. Why do we place the blame on the audience or say the audience or the public want this or not? Whereas when we look at things, we say our technologies are very much behind what the audience needs. Why don't we take groups such as the deaf and blind? I will speak of my case. I find there are no platforms that are translated into a language or symbols that we can read. And in the Arab world, they are even less and less. And I do not know even if they exist. At least I do not know about them. Again, on accessibility, of reading for those with problems in reading or who are blind. But what we are doing is only move what used to be in the print press into the new media. Can there be no autocritique of this new alternative media today?
Observation and criticism implied. I might just take this one from a global perspective, and then we really do need to wind up. I think the point you make is absolutely vital, that diversity in terms of our audiences, and this is about empowering audiences to be engaged with our content such that it moves them to action. For those of us working in independent media, this means hopefully commitments to social change, to the principles of media freedom, whatever the battle is that we're fighting to ensure that powerful people are held to account. Our audiences must come with us. That means we must serve them. And to serve them, we have to recognise that our audiences are diverse, whether that's connected to ability or gender or faith or any other different kind of expression of themselves. So I would just make one point around the capacity to innovate in this respect, particularly if we're dealing with people who are sight impaired. Podcasting is such a cheap and easy and effective way, and I don't know that it's taken off in the Arab world as I hope it will, but especially with investigations, we know that it's one of the most meaningful ways and deep ways that audiences engage with content. There's an intimacy and a conversationality and a deep connection that is forged through the connection between audiences and podcasters that I think offers us, through a technological possibility, something that is quite analog and special, that ancient craft of storytelling and bringing people with us. So I would very much encourage you to consider the power of podcasting and the simplicity, the low-tech nature of it, and the potential to build audiences and to add this on to your visual, investigations, visual-led investigations. Thank you for that important and salient point to end the conversation on. And thank you for staying past 6 o'clock so that we could get to the end of this valuable conversation. I think this is essentially the end of the sessions, and there's a networking opportunity now before the closing ceremony. Thanks very much, guys.